Welcome back. We're finishing with the stuff that actually matters. Tiny steps, identity, honesty, and building a life that can hold weight. And then that wild pivot into building a whole university around better teachers, better access, and less nonsense. The first thing that hit me was that tiny step idea, because it sounds almost insultingly simple. Like after all that philosophical thunder, the prescription is basically, do the smallest thing you can actually do. But that is the point, because when people are wrecked, giant goals just become another way to fail. Yeah, and he's not saying dream smaller forever, he's saying rebuild trust with yourself first. That part made sense to me because competence is addictive in a healthy way. One clean win can do more than 10 motivational speeches. Though I do think people sometimes use tiny steps as a hiding place. They're not rebuilding their life, they're organizing their procrastination. Exactly. There's a difference between healing and politely stalling. But the stronger version is that tiny steps are only useful if they point somewhere. And that ties into the whole road metaphor, where he keeps saying you have to identify the wrong turn. I liked that more than the usual move-on advice because it actually respects memory. Right? Trauma doesn't just disappear because you got busy. It comes back until the mind sees a better path forward. Although if you say that too bluntly, people hear blame instead of repair. True, but I think his bigger point is not guilt, it's location. Like, where did this go wrong? And what can I do now that actually works? Which is a much better question than, why is the universe rude to me? Because the universe is always rude, that part is consistent. The really heavy part was his warning about lies, though. That felt like the core of the whole conversation. Once he gets into ordinary men, peer pressure, and atrocity, it stops being abstract fast. Naked, pregnant women in fields is not a metaphor anymore. That is the abyss. And the terrifying bit is that most people did not start as monsters. They started as ordinary guys who kept saying yes. That's why the lie thing lands so hard, because lies are never just private. They build whole systems where people can do horrible things while feeling decent. And then everyone acts shocked that the machine turned on them. Like, yes, the obvious consequence of moral fog is moral collapse. I also liked his point about white lies being a sign that something upstream is already broken. Because he's basically saying the cleanest answer is the honest one you can live inside tomorrow. Not the dramatic answer, not the cute answer, the one that doesn't poison the next week. And that connects to therapy, marriage, all of it. You fix the present by finding the bad decision you made earlier. Not because you're condemned by it, but because you can finally choose differently. That's actually an empowering idea if you strip away the sermon energy. And there is always sermon energy with him, let's be honest. He could say, pass me the water, and somehow it would become a moral taxonomy. Then the identity section got really interesting because he's basically attacking the modern habit of shrinking people. Yeah, sex, appetite, anger, ideology, one drive becomes the whole self. And he's saying that's immature because it can't hold your life over time. Exactly. Maturity is when multiple parts of you get integrated into one direction. I actually think that's one of his strongest ideas. Because a person ruled by one impulse is basically a hostage with a speech. That is a horrifyingly good line. And then he keeps climbing the ladder. Self, marriage, family, community, country. He treats responsibility like a staircase instead of a punishment. Which is refreshing, because most people now hear responsibility and think loss. But he also goes a bit hard on the idea that self-focus equals misery in every case. I think there's a distinction between self-awareness and self-obsession. Right, because responsibility without a larger purpose just becomes corporate guilt. It's all on me is motivating until it turns into a tiny private courtroom. And that's where he keeps pulling religion back in, whether people like it or not. His argument is basically that you cannot escape serving something higher. If not God, then appetite, ideology, or your own subjectivity. Which is a brutal menu of options, honestly. And I think the real challenge for younger people is that they're told to build identity from fragments. Fragments of desire, fragments of status, fragments of online approval. No wonder they feel unstable. You can't build a cathedral out of notification bubbles. That is absurdly accurate. And then comes Peterson Academy, which felt like the most concrete thing he said all day. It's basically his answer to universities becoming expensive, political, and kind of broken. But the smart part is, he didn't describe it like a revenge project. He described it like a better distribution system for excellent teachers, which is such a clean entrepreneur move, honestly. The institution didn't want me, so I will build a better institution. But he also had a real critique, which is that professors are often mistreated and underpaid. And if you actually care about learning, that should bother you. Because the best teachers should not be trapped in a system that punishes excellence. I liked that he talked about giving people audience, freedom, and money. Those are not small things. That is basically the whole ecosystem. And the way he framed it was strangely humane. For a guy who can turn into a thunderstorm in a minute, that was almost gentle. Almost, yeah. The ending came back to honesty, though, and that felt right. When he says stop lying, he's not making a branding slogan. He means align words, actions, and reality as much as you can. That sounds simple until you try it for a week. Then it becomes terrifying very fast. But I get why that lands with people, because lying is exhausting. And truth is weirdly freeing even when it's inconvenient. He's saying reality becomes an ally if you stop treating it like an enemy. That's the cleanest summary of the whole episode, honestly. And the strange thing is, even with all the grand theory, the message is practical. Take a step, tell the truth, repair the mistake, and pick a better road. Which is almost annoyingly usable. Yeah, nobody likes advice that works because it ruins their excuses. That's probably why the conversation stuck with you so much. It gives people a way back without pretending life is easy. And that feels like the right place to end this series. If people take anything from these 3 episodes, it's probably that order starts with voluntary truth. And then maybe a tiny step, then another one, then a life. Not bad for a final lap. Thanks for riding through the whole series with us, and we'll see you next time. Welcome back. We're wrapping the whole thing with the part that actually changes lives. Tiny steps, identity, and getting unstuck. And honestly, the wild part is how he ties all that to truth, responsibility, and not lying to yourself. Which sounds simple until you realize most people are basically negotiating with chaos. Yeah, and he keeps saying the fix is smaller than people want it to be. That's the annoying genius of it, right? Exactly, because everybody wants a cinematic comeback and he's like, clean your room and tell the truth. Brutal marketing, incredible medicine. But the clinical logic is actually solid, because tiny successful actions rebuild competence. If you've been depressed or frozen, huge goals can feel like fake promises. A small voluntary step feels believable. And belief matters because it gives you traction before you even have confidence. But do you think people sometimes hide behind small steps as a cute productivity hack? Oh, absolutely. And then they call it healing while avoiding their life. Right, like no, bro. You organized one drawer and now you want applause. His point is way harsher than that, because the step has to be voluntary and real. It can't be motivational theater. Exactly, because competence comes from doing what you can actually do, not what sounds noble. That connects to the whole truth thing, too. If you lie about where you are, you pick the wrong next step. And then you stack fantasy on top of failure. Which is basically how people get trapped in their own heads. I kept thinking about how he treats trauma like a wrong road you need to map back from. That's a powerful image because he's not saying the past disappears. He's saying it stops attacking you when you know the road forward. That part felt almost anti-mystical in a good way. Yeah, like sorry, your shadow self does not get the last word. But he also links that to confession, repentance, and atonement, which is where it gets bigger than self-help. Because now it's moral, not just emotional. Right. And I think that's why he keeps dragging the conversation upward. He never lets it stay at feel better. Some people hate that because they want therapy without duty. Therapy as a spa package, basically. With a candle and zero accountability. But then he moves into identity, and that's where the whole thing opens up. Because he's arguing people are too narrow about who they are. Yeah, he hates the idea that your whole self can collapse into appetite, anger, sexuality, or politics. Basically, I am my impulse is a terrible life philosophy. And he's not being prudish, he's saying a person is a hierarchy. That was one of the strongest parts for me. You need the lower drives organized by something higher, or they just fight. And if they win, you get a very loud, very miserable life. A room full of toddlers with credit cards. That's the best description of modern selfhood I've heard all week. Then he adds relationships, family, community, nation, and finally God, which is where people either lean in or completely bounce off. Because he's saying identity matures by becoming useful to something beyond itself. That's a hard sell in a culture built on preference. It is, but it also explains why so many people feel weirdly empty even when they're free. Freedom without direction just becomes appetite with branding. That line is nasty and unfortunately correct. And his critique of modern identity politics lands because he thinks it shrinks the self, like reducing a whole human being to one feature. Exactly, and then asking everyone to bow to that one feature forever, which is a very expensive way to be spiritually 2 years old. Man, he really thinks the modern world is full of overgrown babies. I mean, he's not totally wrong when you look at how people center the self all day. And that loop of self-focus is where misery spikes. He keeps coming back to that psychological point, and it's pretty ruthless. The more you stare at yourself, the worse you feel. Which is awful news for the entire attention economy? Absolutely catastrophic for algorithms. I also liked the tension he drew between responsibility and self-blame. Because responsibility can become poison if it turns into everything is my fault. Yeah, that's where people start turning discipline into shame. He'd probably say responsibility means agency, not cosmic self-hatred. And also not pretending outcomes are proof of moral worth. Right, that was a sharp point about status and merit. Power has always lied to people about what they are. And now the lie is softer, but it's still there. Like, my success proves my goodness, which is a very convenient delusion. Yeah, success loves taking credit for your soul. That whole turn into religion was interesting too, because he treats God as the highest good. Even for people who don't like the word, they still orient toward some version of it. That's the move, right? You always serve something. If it's not God, it's appetite, status, ideology, or comfort. Usually comfort dressed up as intelligence. That one hurts because it's too familiar. And then he pivots to Peterson Academy, which is basically his answer to broken institutions. He's building a university by stripping out the nonsense. Best teachers, real audience, decent pay, no administrative clown show. No administrative clown show should be on the homepage. But there's a serious idea there, which is that good teaching should scale. And it should be treated like something worth protecting. He's basically saying the university got too captured to serve learning properly. And he thinks a parallel institution can restore the original mission. Yeah, and whether people love him or hate him, that instinct is bigger than one guy. It's a bet on merit, audience, and freedom. And maybe a little revenge, if we're being honest. A tasteful amount of revenge. Then the closing question about how he's doing felt oddly important. Because he answered like someone still in pain but not defeated. That was probably the most human moment in the whole thing. He's not claiming perfection, he's claiming meaning, which is a much harder thing to fake. And he turns that into the final challenge. Stop lying and see what reality gives you. That's the through line of the whole episode, honestly. Truth first, then a step, then another step, then a life. And if you're lucky, a life that points beyond yourself. That feels like the cleanest place to land this whole series. We started with chaos and somehow ended up at responsibility. Extremely rude of us, but here we are. Seriously, though, thanks for being with us through all 3 episodes. We'll catch you on the next one. Welcome back. We are finishing the thread on tiny steps, identity, and how people climb out of chaos. And the wild part is that it all comes back to responsibility, not motivation. The first thing that hit me was how he treats lying like a life poison. Not even dramatic lying, just any little fake sentence you keep feeding reality. Which is inconvenient for everyone who survives on polite nonsense. Exactly, because suddenly your whole strategy of smoothing things starts looking expensive. But I think he was making a bigger claim than etiquette. He was saying lies create the path into deeper lies, and then your options rot. That line about being trapped in bad choices upstream is brutal because it feels true. Also, it's annoyingly hard to argue with when you know you've done it. Everyone wants a clean diagnosis until the diagnosis says, hey, you made the mess. And then he links that to therapy, which is basically going back to the wrong turn. Not to relive it, but to identify the road you should have taken. That part is actually hopeful, because it means the past is not just a prison. It becomes a map once you know where the turn went bad. Although I do think people can misuse that idea and just stay in analysis forever. Oh, for sure, some people turn self-reflection into a luxury apartment. Massive windows, no exit, just very expensive emotional furniture. But his version keeps pushing toward action, even if the action is tiny. That's what makes it different from abstract self-help talk. He's basically saying do the smallest voluntary thing you can actually finish. Which is humbling, because people want a 12-step reinvention montage. They want rain, music, a jawline transformation, and a new wardrobe. He's like, no, just make your bed or answer one email or walk outside. And then competence grows from the fact that you actually did the thing. That feels almost embarrassingly simple, which is usually a sign it's real. The hard part is trusting that small wins compound when you're depressed. Depression convinces people the future is one giant wall. He's saying the wall is mostly an illusion of scale. So you shrink the target until your body stops panicking. Which is funny because high-achieving people hate that advice. They'd rather fail heroically than improve modestly. That is such an accurate insult. But exposure therapy follows the same logic in a scarier form. You do not conquer fear by declaring yourself fearless. You walk toward the thing in doses your nervous system can survive. That is such a humane idea, actually. It also respects that fear is physical, not just philosophical. And that connects to the identity part, which I think was the biggest turn in the conversation. He's arguing that modern people get trapped by childish identity models. Basically, I am my appetite, I am my anger, I am my impulse. A very glamorous way to become a mess. Seriously, a whole personality built out of the loudest feeling in the room. His alternative is integration, where different drives get organized into one structure. Not erased, just arranged into something that can actually last. And then he keeps moving outward, which is where it gets interesting. First the individual, then marriage, then kids, then community, then nation. It's almost like he's describing identity as a widening circle of obligation, which is very unfashionable because people want identity without duty. He's saying that isn't identity, that's just preference with a costume on. Oof, that is a nasty line. He really does have a gift for making people feel spiritually audited. But the deeper claim is that responsibility can be psychologically liberating. Because once life is bigger than your own mood, your mood stops ruling everything. That's the paradox people resist the most. You get freer by binding yourself to something bigger than yourself. And that's where he drags religion back into the room. Not subtly either, like he throws the whole cathedral through the window, right into the consumerist living room. His point is that even if you deny God, you still act towards some good. So something like God is sitting underneath your choices anyway. That's uncomfortable because it means nobody is actually value neutral. And if the only God is the self, then the self becomes unbearable. Which explains a lot of modern wellness branding, honestly. It's all candles around a very stressed ego. The interesting tension is that he also refuses to equate success with moral worth. That's an important correction, because our culture does that constantly. He's saying accomplishment is not the same thing as goodness, which should be obvious, but people keep pretending the market is a soul test. If you're rich, you must be chosen by the cosmos, obviously. Strong moral system, very rigorous, no notes. The way he talks about that old aristocratic mindset is so sharp. And then the modern reversal is even weirder because people think outcomes define identity more than ever. Which is exactly why responsibility can feel crushing instead of empowering. If every outcome becomes a verdict on your worth, you start collapsing. That's probably why his hierarchy matters so much to him. It gives a person levels above the panic of the moment. And then the university project makes sense in that light too. Because it's not just content, it's an institutional answer. He's basically saying if universities are broken, build a better one. Which is such a classic move for a person who has been kicked out. I love the combination of revenge and public service there. But he does seem genuinely serious about making elite teaching accessible. And also about protecting professors from being treated like disposable employees. The picture of brilliant teachers being ignored by their own universities is depressing. He's trying to build a place where expertise is actually honored. That part felt less ideological and more corrective. Like, can we just make the best teachers available to more people? That seems to be the whole pitch. And then the final question about how he was doing brought it all back to humanity. He said he's still in pain, but he's not anxious and his mind is clear. That is such a strange, honest kind of victory. Not cured, just very much alive and still moving. And then he lands on that sentence about stopping lies. Not as a moral slogan, but as a practical path back into reality. That's the note I love ending on because it's not mystical at all. It's almost painfully ordinary. Tell the truth, do the next right thing. And somehow that becomes a road out of chaos. That's the full arc of the series for me, from fracture to structure. Start with the smallest, honest step, then let the structure grow around it. Very rude that reality is easier to respect than to escape. Reality is such a bully, but a useful bully, which is the worst kind to argue with. All right, that's us wrapping the last chapter of this series. Thanks for riding with us through the whole conversation. We'll see you in the next one.